Hello everyone, Nicci Fletcher here for the We Are Worthy Summit. And today it is my great pleasure to be talking to Jody Day. Hello Jody.
Hi Nicci.
And one of the, or rather what we're going to be talking about today is So You Want to Become an Author. And I thought the best place for us to start is just to briefly explain why each of us feel qualified, if you like, to be talking about this subject. So Jody, over to you.
Well, thank you. I guess my qualification is here. Here is my book, Living the Life Unexpected, 12 Weeks to Your Plan B for Meaningful and Fulfilling Future Without Children. And this was published in its second edition by Bluebird, which is an imprint of Pan Macmillan in 2016. So that's kind of my credentials. But I'd also like to say that I've been a writer since I was a child, and so it's very much a part of who I am. And I'll talk a bit more later about the process of how I got to having that book published, but it was initially published as a self-published book.
Excellent, thank you, Jody. And you saying you've always been a writer, that's me as well. I often say that if you were to cut me in half like a stick of seaside rock, there would be writer printed through to my core.
Yeah.
And I wrote my first book when I was 4.5. I then stopped writing for many years because of my inner critic telling me that I couldn't spell. I later found out I'm dyslexic, so I didn't write for many years, and then I started writing again, actually as part of the healing process for my infertility, because somebody had said, why don't you write about your experiences? Bizarrely, I never wrote about my experiences then. What I did instead was write and self-publish my books. So the first one here is really ironically a book of children's poetry called Bottom Biting Bears and Other Bedtime Beasties. So that's one book I self-published. I've also self-published this one, which is called Poetic Genes, and that is an anthology of poetry, which is the poetry that I wrote, my mother wrote, and then also both of her parents wrote as well. Wow. And which I think is lovely, and it's a lovely tribute I've done to them. It's definitely in the genes, poetry. And then I've got this is a mini guide to how to write a book to promote your business that I wrote. So that's putting on my business analyst hat. And then finally, this one says display copy up at the top, so I'll try and hide that. But this is called Was Grandad a Spy? It's not actually the story of my grandfather, although he was a spy, an industrial spy. It's actually a book about how to turn your family's histories into a book to share with them more effectively. So I've got a lot of experience of the writing and the self-publishing side. However, I haven't yet done that next step to working with a publishing house. And also I've not yet written anything about being childless not by choice, although I do have the blog and the magazine. Books about that are definitely on the cards for me though. Yeah. So that's sort of our credentials dealt with. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of it then.
Yes.
So why would you say to people that if you feel inspired to, that you should write a book, or perhaps sharing your journey in the form of a book?
Well, I think, on the topic of childlessness, that one of the things I've written that gets quoted a lot is the room called childlessness has many doors, not just didn't want and couldn't have. And I think the power of sharing our stories is a really important part of the healing. I mean, there's a section in my book which is called 50 Ways Not to Be a Mother. It used to say, by the way, in brackets, with apologies to Paul Simon, which you will get, but which when it was being re-edited for the second edition, they said, what does this mean? Oh, no. And I realised that for a younger audience, it didn't mean anything. So, and it's, I mean, that list could go to 100 without, I just stopped at 50 poetically. I could have gone, there are so many ways that we can arrive at unchosen childlessness. And each of those stories is important. And I think when women read echoes of their stories in other women's stories, it brings such an immense sense of relief, and also removes some of the shame around how things have worked out. So I think that, not only is it incredibly helpful to write those stories, it's incredibly helpful to read them.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think it's not only for shame, it's also that feeling perhaps of the fact that nobody else is going through what you are going through. The fact that perhaps you might be abnormal in some way, in the way that you are dealing with things. And although it sounds a bit nasty to say so, I think there's actually a lot of comfort to be had from reading somebody else's story and going, actually, what I'm going through isn't unique, and I'm not abnormal, because this person has also gone through something similar to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's become a big, hashtag phrase, Me Too. But actually, I think they are, two of the most healing words in the language we can hear when we're struggling with something that we feel completely alone with. And certainly around childlessness, when we hear echoes of our stories in another woman's story, it's just like, oh, wow, yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I'm not alone anymore. Yeah.
Yes, I was going to say the other one is You Are Not Alone. Yeah, which ties in very, very closely to that. And the thing I would say is, if you're looking at books which have already been written and you're saying, well, this is very similar to my story, so is there any point in me writing it because it's already been written? What I say to people is that you are sort of the culmination of so many different things. You are made up of your personal experiences, your likes and preferences, what you don't like, what you are interested in. You're made up of your culture, your family background, your education, where you live in the world, and all of these things. And all of that means that the way you write about a situation is going to be very different from the way that somebody else writes about about the same situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's space. I think there's space for many voices, and well, it doesn't seem to stop lots of different people writing books about parenting.
No.
So I think if you look at the size of the parenting shelf, and then you look at the size of the shelf for supporting not just infertility, there's plenty of that, but life after childlessness, we're still probably going to only take up about 6 books on the shelf. I think there's plenty of room for more books about our stories and about how we've got through them and how we can help others to get through them.
Most definitely. I'm sorry about the barking in the background. It's obviously the time for the postman to arrive. So the dogs are just alerting me to that. Yeah. And you were saying about, there are all of these books about parenting. I was just thinking about, there are so many cookbooks. Delia Smith famously wrote a cookbook, which I think was called How to Boil an Egg. Well, there's only really sort of a couple of ways to boil an egg, but so many people have written about different recipes, and it's been like that. Yeah. And actually, it's quite a good similarity to draw, because I have particular preferences in the way that a certain chef will write a recipe. And it will be basically exactly the same recipe as a Chef B. Yeah, sorry about that. So I will like the way that Chef A has written about a particular recipe, but not Chef B, because of their writing style and things. And it's like that with other books as well. So I have got a particular message, and there will be people out there, potential readers, who will only connect or properly connect or resonate with the way that I write it. And they won't connect with a similar type of story that somebody else has written. Yeah. It's a two-way thing, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's the importance of writing a book if you feel inclined to do so. However, writing a book is going to be outside the comfort zone for a lot of people. It's something that they just think that's something I could never do. So without going into the details of sort of family and friends, perhaps, What sort of professionals can you have to are there available to actually help with the writing process?
I think it's really interesting. I think when one is thinking about writing a book, you can spend an enormous amount of time procrastinating by seeking out expert opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks to the internet, it is always available. So, and I certainly did this, kind of going on creative writing courses, reading things online, endlessly reading books written by writers about the writing process. I think I was really hungry for kind of, I don't know, clues about how to do it. And I think there is value in that. And I think certainly being part of a writing group or doing a writing course or following a writing program can really, really help to build your confidence. But there comes a point when you kind of really, you have to get on with writing. Because you can spend your whole life preparing to write.
Yes, most definitely. And I think that actually by practicing writing, you get better at writing as well. Writing is like a muscle. It needs to be exercised. And I certainly know if I look back at some of the things that I wrote 4 or 5 years ago, I look back at that and I go, hang on a minute, how on earth did I think that this was actually acceptable? And I do have to say that I am a bit of a perfectionist, so I've got pretty high standards. But even given that into account, taking that into account, I can see that my writing style has changed. It has grown. It has got stronger, most definitely. And that is because I write. It's not going to happen if you are a theorist rather than somebody who actually does it.
Yeah, and for me, the actual doing of it was my blog. So before Gateway Women, I had just like a personal blog, which was, because I'm quite an early adopter of technology, so I was kind of playing around with them, and I had a personal blog on which I kind of wrote about films I was seeing, books I was reading, and all kinds of stuff. And on that, and it was a tremendous relief to me, that blog, because it felt like, I don't know, I was experimenting with my voice, and I pressed publish and it was out there.
Yes.
And that really helped me to develop my authorial voice, but an online version of my authorial voice, which was interesting because after writing it, I don't know, probably for a year or so, I used to post them on Facebook, and a few of my friends would read them, nothing very big. And they started to say things, we can really hear you. It's like you're talking to us.
Yes.
And after I sort of heard that a few times, I just thought, oh, this is what they must mean when they say finding your voice.
Yep.
And so then when I started the Gateway Women blog, I was already comfortable with that. And so I started with that voice.
Yes.
But when I look back to my early blogs and now, and I look back to, as you say, I look back on some of my old writing and, even my fiction style. I moved house recently, so I found all these old half-finished novels that I was, started reading instead of finishing the packing. And I could see, like you, that it had shifted. And that what I really notice now is that my style, my voice, if you were to read that, you might, that I think Jody wrote that.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's practice.
It is practice, and also I think it's about connecting with your own authentic self. Because I'm a great believer in reading other people's books to be inspired by them in terms of their writing style, however, not to emulate them, because you need to own it yourself as well. And it's little things that I found in the fact that I've probably got a little tiny bit more direct in the way that I say things than I used to. And that's all to do with the fact that I have got further down my own healing process.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I'm much happier now and much more confident about speaking out So before, where I might have said a sentence, this is going to sound incredibly waffly, however it will illustrate the point, I might said, one of the things you might perhaps consider doing if you really feel that you are up to it, and so many qualifications in that before I actually get to the point. That's how I would have written a few years ago. Hopefully not to that extent. Now it's a case of, you can.
Yeah.
And it's much more succinct and it's much more direct. And that is a reflection of the fact that I am feeling much more comfortable and confident in my own skin as a person, as a childless woman, and as a writer as well.
Yeah, I would agree that my style feels a lot more direct. Also, I've done so much writing online over the last few years. And, goodness knows how many billions of words I must have written in the Gateway Women online communities, on blogs, on Facebook posts, on every kind of thing. And that sort of getting to the point is really what you need to do when you're writing online. Often people might even be looking at it at a tiny screen on their phone. So, and even, Twitter was 140 characters until very recently. It's like haiku. It's like, how precise can I be? That has definitely influenced my style. Yeah. I mean, another area of my writing is that I'm also completing my training to be a psychotherapist. And at the moment, I need to get back into like a huge pile of academic writing. And it's really hard because my muscle has gone the other way.
Yes.
And actually academic writing, and you can imagine psychotherapy writing, it is quite qualified. Academic writing, you don't say, well, this is how it is. You kind of go, it could be said.
On the other hand, alternatively, why don't? Yes.
So actually I'm having to sort of bring that more qualified style back up. But my writing style is a lot punchier, a lot more direct. And to what you said about finding my voice, I found my voice in my life, and I'm at peace with my identity as a childless woman. And so that comes through in my writing, which is that I don't feel like I've got anything to hide. I'm not trying to pretend to be someone else. I can be quite funny, quite flippant, quite serious, incredibly compassionate, all in the same paragraph. It's like, it's me.
Yes. This is what you get.
Yeah.
And I think when people start saying, people who know you well start saying, I can really hear you coming out in this. It's like you're in the room talking to me, which I think is one of the biggest compliments that somebody has paid to me about my blog is, and this was actually somebody who I didn't know. They said, when I was reading this, it felt that you were in the room talking to me.
It is a huge compliment. Yeah.
Now we've been talking about blogs and articles and this and that. So I want to just clarify here that when we are talking about becoming an author, we really are talking about a book.
Yes.
Not a blog, not an article. They all have their place. They are important. However, we are focusing on a book. And I think that we are also talking about a physical book rather than an e-book as well. Yeah. So bearing that in mind, let's now turn our thoughts to the different publishing options that we've got, so we can just clarify some of the different ways that you can publish that physical book. What thoughts have you got on those?
Well, I initially, when I decided that I was going to start turning what had become my Reignite Weekend program and everything I was learning through Gateway Women into a book, I thought, okay, self-publishing. I mean, I did speak to a couple of publishers. They were vaguely interested in it. They had sort of different ideas about what the book should be about. And they were really interesting conversations. They gave me a real sort of, oh, okay. And then I thought, okay, I just need to write my book. And I decided to self-publish. And I got tremendous support from the Gateway Women community around the world. So actually I crowdfunded the costs of self-publishing my book. The Gateway Women logo and the book cover of the original book, which I don't have with me now, which many women will know because it had sort of 3 aviators on the front cover was very, very different, is, you know, it was very much, I was supported by the women who wanted to read that book.
Yes.
To help pay for it to come into the world, because self-publishing isn't free. There are quite a few associated costs if you want it to look like what I call a real book at the end. Some self-published books do look pretty amateur when you hold them in your hand, and I was determined that my book would feel like a real book for those women who needed it to feel like a real book as well. You know, I wanted them to be proud of it too.
Yes, and that's a very good point. And you know, I showed up my 4 books, and I look back at particularly the anthology of poetry, which was actually the first book I self-published. And I look back at that cover, and it's a case of I would not do it that way again now. And I had used what's called a short-run digital, a short-run digital printing. So I only had 100 copies of that book produced, which was all I really needed. So it wasn't a huge issue. And that's one of the advantages nowadays of self-publishing, is that you don't have to do 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 runs.
I didn't have to do any run at all of my book. I chose to publish it on a platform called Create Space, which was then is now part of Amazon.
Yes.
So I had to find someone to help me design the cover, to help do the book layout, which was actually the most labor-intensive part of it, was to lay out the text in a beautiful way, design the illustrations, even design the bullet points. It was a huge amount of work making the inside look really professional and slick, and then everything uploaded to Create Space, and they then print on demand. So that also meant that it was immediately available through Amazon and through all the websites that Amazon served. So like the Book Depository and all of those others were able to order it. So yes, it was a physical book, but it was only available online at first. Yeah. And then Kindle was available through Amazon as well.
And just to clarify the thing about print on demand, it's, if you think about the unit cost to produce a book, you've got my 100 copies, and you divide the cost that the cost of producing the 100 copies divided by 100 gives you your unit cost. And when you are doing a short run, digital run, the unit cost is going to be slightly less than your print on demand. However, you haven't got the upfront costs to pay, because basically I had to pay for 100 copies of my book. With print on demand, as you say, you go onto Amazon, you see your book, and sometimes how you get something which says this will be shipped in sort of 1 to 2 weeks. That's sometimes, not always, but sometimes an indication that it's a print on demand book. Basically, the book gets printed once there is an order. The unit cost is slightly more expensive. However, you then also don't have the logistics of how to actually.
Then you've got the distribution as well. It's printing and distribution, and my book was and is bought all around the world.
And that's a huge issue if you are going to self-publish and you're doing a short run instead. So we've sort of covered a bit about print on demand, or POD printing. There's a short run digital option as well. And then I just want to briefly cover what's called concierge publishing. And this is a branch of self-publishing where you've basically got an organisation who isn't a sort of a traditional publishing house who covers the cost of all of the publishing. They take the financial risk. It's still a self-publishing route, but what they provide is a portfolio of services. So the writer approaches them, and for a fee, the concierge publishing company will pay for the editing or get the editing done, do the cover design, do the graphic design, the internal layout, and they will do all of those things on behalf of the writer. But it's not an astronomical cost that they mark up, because there needs to be a distinction between a concierge publisher who is a self-publishing service and something called vanity publishing scams. And this is something that I am very passionate about telling people about, because I used to do work as a writing mentor. And let's just go back a tiny step for a moment. Historically, all self-publishing was considered to be vanity publishing. Mm-hmm. Because the idea was, you only self-publish if your book isn't good enough to get a publishing deal. And I can understand that 20 years ago, etc. And the distinction I make is that is vanity publishing with lowercase v and p. Whereas what I'm talking about here is publishing scams, and that's a capital V for vanity, capital P for publishing. Because these are the companies who advertise the fact that they will accept all manuscripts.
Yeah.
That is a huge warning sign, because a publishing company will not do that. It's on merit. They will then sometimes say things like, we pay the largest royalties or greatest royalties in the publishing industry, up to 40%. And you go, oh, that's fantastic, because I've heard that normally you only get to 6 to 8%, so 40%. Wow, that's fantastic. But unfortunately, it's not actually a royalty. It is it's a discount on books. So basically, you say, I want to have 10 copies of the book. My book costs £10. That's the RRP. I get a 40% discount, which means that I buy the book for £6, and then I make my profit, if you like, on that book by selling it for £10. And it's a huge scam, and they charge an awful lot of money.
Yeah.
I've got a personal friend who fell into the trap of thinking that she'd found a proper publishing company. It was a scam, and she paid over £3,000 for 10 copies of her book.
Yeah.
And then the book was horrendous quality as well.
Yeah.
No,
certainly even some of those concierge publishers one still has to be careful of, because some of them you really have to look at the small print, check them out with the Royal Society of Authors, ask around, have to see, kind of, if it looks too good to be true, don't go there.
It probably is,
yeah.
One of the easiest things that I do nowadays is I will type in a company's name or something, and then type scam or hoax after the word.
I do exactly the same.
Yeah. All of those Facebook warnings that you get, about the fact that so and so will send you a friend's request, and it will steal all of your friends, or it will hack your site. No, I type in that person's name, type in scam or hoax, and 99% of the time, actually, it comes up with the fact that,
it turned out actually that the truth about Facebook was way worse than any of the hoaxes.
Yes, I know, that's so ironic, isn't it? But that's a discussion for a whole nother topic. Okay, so we've covered then about the self-publishing side of things, and the warning about these vanity publishing scams. What we haven't covered is about the traditional bona fide publishing houses then.
Yes, I was very happy as a self-published author, and happy also because it was a really significant revenue stream in the early days at Gateway Women, because I was making about $4 a copy on each book, which was really important. It was keeping the boat afloat. But there came a point when I wanted to think about international editions in particular, and having been through the pain barrier of self-publishing and making the book beautiful in my own language. The thought of trying to do that in a foreign language, I thought, I just can't do this. And it was serendipitous. The introduction to my publisher, Carol Tonkinson at Bluebird, was serendipitous. It came through a Gateway Woman. We actually already knew each other from a previous life. We'd met in a different role, and she was very keen on the book. However, what was very interesting was that she said, it's a great book, but I'm not sure there's a big enough market for it. Because I had been self-publishing for 2 years, I had all of my data. So I was able to show my sales in different territories, in ebook, in Kindle format, in Kobat format, and in physical book. And I had I had those numbers, and that was hugely important when she then made the business case for my book with the publishing team, because publishers do not make very much money anymore. Because they have to give such massive discounts on the books to Amazon. Amazon's making the money, not the publishers.
Yeah.
So it's actually very difficult for publishers to publish a completely unknown author. I'm sorry, but a sort of a biography of sort of some celebrities left it is going to do really, really well.
Yes.
They guarantee that's going to sell out at WH Smith's at Christmas. So they can do that, but it's a new author or a niche subject. They tend to be cautious, and they have to be, because they don't have money to throw around anymore.
Yeah. They are in business, and they're in business, yes, to publish books, but they're in business to make money so that they can publish books. We have to be brutally honest about that.
Yeah. No, the margins are low. Margins are low. Yeah.
Margins are low, and that's one of the reasons why they don't accept all manuscripts, because they can't.
They'd be out of business if they did that, because the physical process, it's so kind of industrial, producing a book. It's about trees and ink and paper and lorries and machines and moving things around the world. It's like it's such a kind of, there's so many moving parts in creating and distributing a physical book, and that's even before it gets to bookshops and book staff, and so there are an awful lot of people down that supply chain who need to be paid.
Yes.
So there's very little profit left for the author or for the publishers.
Now you said that you actually were introduced to your publisher.
Yeah.
One of the things that people say to me about writing a book, and how when I say how difficult it is to get a publishing deal, is they say, oh, well, you get an agent, they'll do it for you. Sometimes I think it can be actually harder to get an agent to take you on than it can be to get a publisher to take you on, because again, they are in the business of finding books that they think that they can find a home for. And it's not just as simple as picking up the Yellow Pages or doing a Google search and finding, okay, that's an agent, I will get that agent and they will find me a publishing deal. It doesn't work like that.
It doesn't, and I think that makes it so important these days to have what's called an author platform. And this is something you will read about a lot in sort of blogs and books about writing, which is that being an author is no longer about sort of sitting at home writing and then just turning up with your manuscript and giving it to the world. What an agent will look for and what a publisher will look for, they will look to see that you have an online presence. They will look to see that actually you already have a readership. You have people that are waiting for your book, and that you engage with your readers and with your community in a way that is kind of the way now, that they expect authors to do it. I think this is tricky. I think some of the best writers in the world are going to be introverts. And for every tweet that I write, for every Facebook post that I comment on, for every interaction that I do, those are words that I'm not putting into a book.
Yes.
And so, that takes away from my, not just from my writing time, but also from my writing energy.
Yes.
There's only so many words I can write a day. And if I've kind of written a beautifully crafted, response to someone's, on Facebook, on the Gateway Women Facebook page, do you know what I mean? I'm unlikely to create that paragraph again in a book.
Yeah, most definitely.
So it does, yes, it's necessary, but it's tough.
It's
tough to do both, but you're unlikely to get either a publishing deal or an agent without it. Yeah,
most definitely. And actually, it brings me quite nicely on to another myth as well. I was talking to somebody before I published my first book, and they said, but you're a writer. Why don't you get a publishing deal? Because you're a writer and you should be concentrating on writing, not publishing. You need to think about what you want to do. And I had to explain to them about the fact that gone are the days when you basically handed over your book to the publisher, and they said the the publicity mechanism, if you like, the machine, took over, and the writer, all they had to do was appear at a book signing event. In this case, if it doesn't happen nowadays, the writer is responsible for an awful lot of their own publicity.
The writer has to be more of an entrepreneur. You have to be, and I think they call it an authorpreneur.
Okay.
You've got to promote yourself, present yourself, and you got to be, tweeting and blogging and, organizing your own book signings and organizing your own PR opportunities. Yeah. And if you don't do that, chances are your book will never be seen.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't want people to be put off by that, because there are huge advantages of writing your book, and huge things to celebrate, which I'm sure we'll cover a little tiny bit later on. So we sort of talked about the different publishing options then. What about the actual physical process of writing? For instance, how do you structure your book? How do you decide what type of genre, if you like, you're going to write?
I think that's going to be completely individual. Certainly for me, I've got an awful lot of half-finished books, which that actually I just ran out of passion for them, because I hadn't yet found my voice and I hadn't yet found my topic. And it wasn't really until I wanted to write a book about, how to recover from childlessness, that it was actually that the book wanted to be written through me. It was not that I needed to sit down and decide to write a book. It was just like, I'm obviously going to have to write this book because it won't leave me alone.
Yes.
It chose me rather than me choosing it. And structuring it was super important. I think it's going to be different if you're writing fiction or non-fiction. I'm writing fiction at the moment, but I'll talk about the non-fiction process, which is that I structured the hell out of it.
Yes.
I'd been teaching, a lot what's in the book. I've been teaching on my workshops and in my groups. I've been writing blogs on these topics. I had a really good feeling for what, I wanted to do. So I used something called Workflowy, but you can use an Excel spreadsheet or pen and paper. But I broke it down. I broke down each section, each chapter. I broke each chapter down into sections. Yes. And I had a word count for each section. This was also tremendously helpful because I was writing the book and fitting it in with other things. So, I would open it, I would look at the spreadsheet and I'd go, okay, I need to write a section on that. So then I jumped to that paragraph. I jumped to kind of, chapter 10, and I think, okay, that's 500 words. Yeah, I can do 500 words. And I'd go for it. So that's how I got through the first draft, which is that I had a very clear plan. However, when I got to the end of the first draft, I was determined it was going to be 10 weeks to your plan B, because I didn't want it to be 12 because of 12 being the 12 steps.
Yes.
So I had this chapter in the middle. I don't know, it must have been sort of chapter 8 or something like this. It was a monster. And I just, at the end of the first draft, I thought, that is too big. And I broke it down and it did fit into 3. And it was like, okay, this book wants to be 12 chapters. And I have to surrender to that. So the second draft was very much about that. And the second draft was much harder than the first one, because for me, it was about fixing the holes. So when I've been writing the first draft written, I thought, I'll look up that data later. Or I'll just check that later. Anyway, the second draft, I had to do all that. The second draft was much harder, much harder work. Yes. Because it was much more precise.
Yeah, it's the polishing process. Yeah. And I love the bit about you saying that, sometimes you write a book and it's because you want to write it, and then other books are the books telling you have to write it. And I was laughing when you say that you've got so many books that you've half written, because I've got that as well. Well, actually, it's non-fiction and also the fiction, and also the Childless Not by Choice books as well. And you saying that sometimes your book tells you have to write it. I had a very vivid dream of a little fairy called Isadora having a very heated debate with Henry VIII's and Catherine of Aragon about whose book was most important, because I've got both books that I was sort of working in. They were both work in progress at the time, and I had this very vivid dream about this 2.5-inch fairy going up against Henry VIII, demanding that I spent the time to write her book, not his book. And it's a case of that was a huge indication that my subconscious, or my book, was telling my subconscious, oi, you've got to deal with this one first. And I did, and then that sort of gave me the headspace to deal with the other ones. And in terms of the structuring, I mean, the techniques that I tend to use initially are I use mind maps a lot to do my initial everything, including the kitchen sink, sort of information dump onto a page. And then I start looking at those mind maps, and I use something called Moscow analysis, which is all about finding my must-haves, what I must include, what I should include, what I could include, and what I won't include. And that helps me to sort of get rid of the kitchen sink and start to prioritize what's important. And the must-haves often become chapter headings, and then the shoulds are my subheadings, and then the coulds are the icing on the cake, which adds in the more detail in there. And I use those two processes to eventually come up with, and this is for non-fiction, I come up with a detailed outline, which is heading, chapter heading, subheading, and then bullet points of the content. And then I go through and I say, okay, I've got half an hour to write. I'm going to write this section, and I will do changing my bullet points into actual tangible sentences.
It sounds like we've a slightly different way into what we ended up with the same thing. I'm wondering how different is it for you writing fiction? Because I'm writing fiction at the moment. How's your kind of structuring process?
My structuring process is I still end up actually with quite a detailed outline for my character plots, for my plot. I then also have information about my character's personality and things like that, so I get to know my characters. And then I actually let the story write itself. So I've got what I hope to happen. I've got my plan A. What actually sometimes happens doesn't happen, because the characters themselves, I'll be writing something and I might be trying to follow plan A, and I write myself into a corner, and I need to then go back and so take a step back and go, okay, what would this character actually do in those situations? And that I find I write myself into a corner when I am trying to write the book, rather than the character and the plot writing the story and sharing the story. I'm having that experience at the moment, because my character, sometimes I'm in the middle of a section of dialogue or exposition, and something I wasn't expecting starts to happen, and I'm like, oh, it's going to be like that. And then, of course, the structural part of me thinks, oh, shite, that means I'm going to have to put that bit up there. We're going to have to learn about this earlier. I'm going to have to, oh, that can't happen after. That's now got to happen before. And I've got to go back and change something that I wrote 3 chapters ago, because now that doesn't make sense.
So the structure, I find, is much more dynamic than the structure for nonfiction, which really, once I'd set it, apart from that thing where I'm talking about the fact that 1 chapter needed to become 3, it didn't really change. Most definitely. And except when you're writing nonfiction, you still need to go back at some stage and think about the flow. And you can think about that, you can plan it beforehand. However, it's only when it's written that you can actually double check that the flow is correct. I have a vague memory, actually. It feels like a long time ago now. It was 2012 that I wrote the book, that I did move one of the chapters around. That one of the chapters is not in its original order. And the title came after I'd finished the book. The title was not the original title that I gave it.
almost always have a working title. Because it's only when the book is finished. And also, I think sometimes people, particularly if they're writing non-fiction, they start off with sort of a foreword. And it's a case of, how can you write your foreword, which is about what the book's about, until you've written the book?
It's the same actually with academic essays. You actually really need to write before you can write the introduction. I usually start by writing the introduction, because it's almost like a kind of, stretching my muscles.
Yes.
It's like a warm up, but I know the chances are it's going to be cut. But it's just a way in.
Yes, it is, and you've got to start somewhere, haven't you? Now, I mentioned some things about using mind maps, Moscow, and my very structured outline. What I will do is I will find out some little videos that I've got which cover those sorts of things. They will not be We Are Worthy Summit branded. It will be another hat that I'm wearing at the time. However, the information is still exactly the same. It's just the slide says something different. So I hope people will forgive me about that. However, that might just give people an idea about some of the practical tools that you can use to help in these situations. Now, talking about practical tools and stuff, what about any editing and proofreading? I know that we should be using professional people to do this. However, I personally like to have a little bit of an edit and a proofread before I send anything out. So do you have any sort of techniques that you can share on those two subjects?
Absolutely. I think proofreading is one of the things I always do, and it's quite labor intensive, but it works for me. Is and as you've read through the manuscript several times, it becomes harder and harder to see errors. So one of the things I do is I highlight the whole document and I change the font to something I really hate, something I would never use, so it's kind of really visually compelling to me. And then I print it out and I read it out loud. Because the process of reading something out loud, it uses a slightly different part of the brain to reading. And so as you read a sentence, you suddenly realize there's a word that it's in your mind, but it's not on the paper. Or you've got something in the wrong one. So that's my kind of main tip for proofreading, is weird font and read it out loud. Editing is harder. Editing often means, as one of very famous phrase from writing, which is that you have to kill your darlings. And that is really, really hard. Can be passages that you just know, this is my writing at its best, but it's not needed. That is really, really hard, and that can often be when a second pair of eyes can come. I like you, I do a lot of editing before anyone else gets to read it, and sometimes putting it in a drawer, or that's what the old-fashioned way is, or just leaving it as a file on your computer, not looking at it for 6 weeks, then going back. Then you can often see, actually, this bit here, it's great, but this isn't actually a very important character, or I'm kind of waffling, and this is better covered later in the book if it's non-fiction, and you go, you know what, it's going to have to go. What I do then is I take that part, I don't delete it because that just feels too horrible. I have a separate document which is called spare text, and I just move it into that. So I know that if I want it back, I can go reclaim it at a later date, but I basically take it off the page. And that's the main part of my editing process before it's then professionally edited. And when you have a publisher, really one of the gifts of having a professional publisher is that usually your publisher themselves, or they will also appoint someone to edit your book for you, and that is an amazing process, to have someone's dispassionate eye on it, who is not a friend or a relative or someone who might find it hard to say, yeah, it's great. God, it goes on.
And we'll talk a little tiny bit later on about using family and friends to help with the process as well. The two techniques I've got, the proofreading technique is quite similar to yours, in the sense that what I do, again, forces my brain to actually read what is on the page. What I do is I basically start if it was an old-fashioned book of fiction, you know how they used to say the end at the end, I would go to that point and I would proofread backwards. So it would be end the. And then I would look at each individual word. It does take time, but I would look at each individual word, reading from the back of the book, the end of the book, to the beginning of the book. Because again, we read from left to right, up to down on the page. What you're forcing your brain to do is something very unnatural, which is reading from right to left and from the bottom of the page up to the top of the page.
And does that help you pick up spelling
Typos.
errors?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because you are forcing your mind to actually look at the word rather than the whole sentence.
Yeah.
And then for the editing, what I do is, again, I start at the end of the book rather than the beginning of the book, and I work backwards. But I basically look at each sentence. So I'll look at the last sentence as a sentence in the whole, so reading left to right, and I will grade that sentence as a 1, 2, up until 10. And basically, if it's a 1, it's probably not needed. If it's a 10, there's no way that I can improve that sentence. And those are the, the 1s and the 2s and the 9s and the 10s are the easy ones to deal with, because it's so obvious what you need to do. It gets a bit harder when you're doing those 4, 5s and 6s. But what you're basically doing is highlighting the sentences which are important, the content which is important. You need work on the sentence though, and the idea is to get everything up to an 8, 9 or 10.
Wow, that is amazingly thorough and analytical. We've got very different approaches. Because I find also that the reading out loud
definitely
helps me to hear and identify. Sometimes I have a tendency to write my sentences too long.
Yes.
Especially when it's a very complex thought I'm trying to, and I'm reading it and I'm just like, oh God.
I need to take a breath.
And also I'm halfway through here and I'm sort of, my attention's wandering.
Yes.
And it's so, for me, I think maybe I'm more auditory than analytical in the way that I work.
Yeah, you will find that I never know whether I'm a very creative, logical person or a very logical, creative person. But I have this very logical side, which goes back to those sort of step-by-step processes. And I think the reason why I don't read it out loud is that, being slightly dyslexic, I actually find it difficult to read out loud. And that is a bit of a barrier to me. So I can fully appreciate why it works for a lot of people. I just know it doesn't work for me.
But like many dyslexics that I know, you found a workaround that fits with the way that your brain structure works, that allows you to do it.
Yes.
That's my experience, is that all of the dyslexics in my life are incredibly creative.
Yes, I think we are, because we find ways of working.
And all of them amazing with language. Actually, my partner is dyslexic, and he's amazing. His understanding of language, his spoken, his use of words, and his writing when he does it, which isn't very often because it's slow for him. But
it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah,
really fascinating. So we've dealt with sort of the editing and proofreading, and there are a couple of techniques that we've both shared about how you can do it yourself. Obviously, it's much better to get a professional person to do it, because there are going to be errors. And even when you have professional people doing it, there are typos occasionally. People understand that. It's when it's littered with errors, though, that people struggle with it, because the best content can be the best content can be ruined by poorly written writing, whereas well-written writing can improve poor content, which is really weird. So it's important to get the sort of the level of the polish, if you like, up as high as it can be. Moving on.
One thing I would just say about that is not to worry too much about that at first.
Yes, oh, most definitely.
Just get that first draft done.
Yeah.
One of the most useful pieces of writing advice I ever got was from the writer Anne Lamott in her book Bird by Bird, and it's about did you hear that? That was a ping, a notification on my phone. I'm just going to turn it on. Yeah, and just so you know, I'm going to have to go quite soon as well.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was in a book by Anne Dillard, and it's called Bird by Bird. And really, that's how you write. It's like, you don't have to. It's just bird by bird. And she talks about this concept of actually, you don't need to write a great book. You just need to write a shitty first draft.
Yes. And
you can do that. And that was for me, that was so liberating. I was much more of a perfectionist in those days. And I thought, I can do that. And I think if you get, as you're writing, if you're trying to edit and you're trying to polish and you're trying to check for typos and all of those things, you're not writing.
No.
So you leave that till the end. Just get to, as you say, the end before you worry about any of that.
Which leads me on to another technique that I use very frequently, particularly when I've got something very structured and a short amount of time, is I use a technique called free writing. And that is basically, you set yourself a time limit of 5 minutes and you cannot go over that 5 minutes. You're not allowed to correct spelling. You're not allowed to correct grammatical errors. You must never stop writing. So you're either typing continually or you're writing physically continually. Even if you are writing or typing, I don't know what I need to write now. And by doing that and not going back and correcting errors, you are locking the left-hand side of your brain, the analytical side, out. You are locking the editor out of the room, and you're allowing your more creative side, freedom to do whatever it wants. And you do that for 5 minutes, and then you stop. If you want to carry on writing, you go and walk around the room, go into the garden for 10 minutes, and then you come back and do another 5 minutes. And that's how a lot of people get their first drafts done. And then you go back and you let the editor into the room.
Yeah. Those editors can be very hard work at first.
The inner critic is terrible, and we probably unfortunately don't have time to cover this because I know that you've got to leave soon. So just winding up then, is there anything else that you would like to share before we finish this? And then hopefully somebody else will come onto a call and I'll be able to cover some of the other bits and pieces.
I think I think it's just
I know what I'd like to ask you. To end up, I had a very powerful experience when I held this book for the first time. What did it feel like? Getting back to the celebration and how good this is. What did it feel like for you when you held your book in your hands for the first time?
It was extremely emotional. It arrived. My books arrived from America. It was a sort of draft copy from Create Space. And when I held it in my hand, I mean, I had goosebumps all over, and I still do, because it felt like the culmination of, so much. My own childless journey. The journey of Gateway Women to that point, but also the journey from the little girl who, like you, had written a book on paper, folded it in half, stapled it, designed a little cover, do you know what I mean? And, it was just this tiny little thing, that size, and 2 matchboxes together. But that was, my whole life, I had been preparing for the moment.
Yes.
I held my book in my hand, and when it came, it was sweet.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. Bittersweet for me. I was so thrilled. But seeing it, this is a photograph of my grandfather.
Yeah.
And it was some of the reasons for writing the book is that he has such a huge, amazing story to tell, even though that's not his story. And it was the fact that there was a bit of sadness about the fact that he wasn't there to see it. as well. So it was a bittersweet thing. And I can remember when I got the first copy of the children's poetry book, I had it on my bedside table that night, and I woke up so many times just to reach out and put my hand on it to make sure it was still there, but it wasn't a dream. And eventually, Andrew, when he woke up, he sort of said, I was asleep like this, touching it, because I wanted to make sure it was still there and it wasn't a sort of a figment of my imagination. And it is a wonderful experience. It really is. It is a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to interrupt? Because because I did interrupt you. Sorry.
I think that's a beautiful ending. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for doing this, Jody, and for everything you're doing as well for the rest of the summer. It's been absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
You take care. Bye.
Thank you, Nicci. Thank you. Bye.
Pleasure.